And just say welcome. My name is Andrew Carberry with the Wallace Center. Um, Today's call is Building the Pipeline, Finance and Funding for Impact. And this is the third in a series on institutional investment in supply chains, which started with conversations focused on healthcare and university settings. And today's call will focus on how we finance these efforts. So our call today is about 75 minutes. We'll start with some framing and background, and then talk with two sets of panelists and have time for discussion amongst all the panelists at the end. And right now I'm inviting myself and all of you to turn off any distractions and just get grounded for our time together here. Feel free to take a couple of deep breaths as we get settled in. Since we're meeting on Zoom, just some quick Zoom tech. You're starting out as muted, and we'll be using the chat box, which you can find on the bottom of your screen, to share any comments or questions with our guests and panelists today. You can also reach out to myself or Elizabeth Atwell through the chat directly if you have Zoom or tech issues throughout the call. There we go. So today's webinar is brought to you by the Food Systems Leadership Network, which is a national peer learning community that connects current and emerging leaders, strengthens individual and collective leadership capacity, and fosters collaboration across communities. The goal of the network is to accelerate the realization of a just, equitable, and sustainable food system that generates good food, health, and opportunity for all. We invite you to check out foodsystemsleadershipnetwork.org after this call to connect with other members and check out our resources. In the Wallace Center's work supporting value chain enterprises and community-based nonprofit organizations, anchor institutions often come up as a potential partner because they have unique ability and responsibility to support equitable, local, and sustainable supply chains. Institutions are often a huge opportunity on the demand side in making commitments to purchase a certain percentage of local products, but they can fall short because the supply side isn't developed enough, especially for producers and businesses run by people of color who have been systematically excluded. Our guiding question in developing this series is, how can institutions move from just seeking out local or values-based supply chains to investing in the hard and soft infrastructure necessary to meet their goals of equitable, local, or sustainable purchasing? We are learning ourselves about this practice and seeking out promising examples and sharing those out throughout the community. Our goals today are to share the overall context of this work and allow community leaders to explain their strategy and share their stories of working with institutions who have made these types of investments to improve access to institutional markets for food and farm businesses, with an emphasis on Black, Indigenous, and people of color owned businesses. With that in mind, we were interested in both the logistical and infrastructure issues and in assessing the power dynamics at play in financing these efforts. We acknowledge the immense amount of work that's gone into understanding this landscape and are thankful to those who have led the way in this work, including the Center for Good Food Purchasing, Healthcare Without Harm, Farm to Institution New England, the Democracy Collaborative, all our speakers on the call today, and many others. Their work has been critical to our understanding and the work and design of this conversation series. So in today's conversation, we'll focus on the pivotal role financing plays in building strong, local, sustainable, and equitable food economies. For many practitioners, finance is like a foreign language that we know is very important, but is not intuitive to understand. Today's guests will discuss ways that financing tools can be used to support regional food economies and explore new approaches to financing food systems change. These are the same types of strategies we seek to support through the Institutional Investment Accelerator, which we'll share more about at the end of today's call. And now I'd like to launch a poll just to gauge your familiarity and confidence with these topics. So I'll have this up. You can just get your responses in, and I'll introduce our next speaker. This work wouldn't have been possible without support from Elliott Smith, who has been working as an extension of the Wallace Center team to research promising practices in institutional investment and bring together people and concepts from the financial and community-based sides of this work to host these conversations. Elliott is a former Wallace Fellow with experience shifting institutional procurement programs and implementing the Good Food Purchasing Program in Central Texas and developing value chains in Colorado and the Pacific Northwest. Elliott is the co-founder of Kitchen Sink Strategies. He brings public, philanthropic, and private sector experience to the work of building regional food economies that nourish people and the planet. We'll be publishing a series of articles on institutional investment authored by Elliott over the next couple of weeks. Okay, thanks for those that have filled out the poll. I'm just briefly going to share the results. Looks like a nice little bell curve, and I think our speakers and our plan today should meet everyone where you are. And now I'll hand it over to Elliott.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, it's interesting to see. Welcome, everybody. We really are glad you're here with us. This is an exciting conversation. I hope it's going to be a unique one. I think the mix of folks that we'll be speaking with here have a great set of perspectives. It is going to be sort of a conversation, a more plenary style than presentation. So we won't be doing a full-blown Q&A. That said, if you have a burning question during the chat here, please do enter it into the chat, and we'll hopefully have some good time at the end of the conversation to incorporate it for a conversation with our panelists. But I want to start, I'll introduce each of you panelists. I think we're still waiting on Monica to join, unless she's crept in and I didn't notice, but we're gonna do sort of a two-part conversation. One where we set the tone, talk a little bit about some big picture stuff around finance and ag, and then dig in a little bit on the practitioner side. And I'll introduce each of the speakers in each of those sections and provide their bios, starting with David and Eric here. Yeah, Eric Horvath, who's here, you can wave, everybody can see you. Eric is the Director of Capital Strategies at Common Future, which is a network of leaders rebuilding an economy that includes everyone. At Common Future, Eric leads the design and development of innovative capital products for BIPOC, with an emphasis on creating more just terms, structures, and impacts. And he collaborates closely with network leaders across the country to reimagine and really restructure the equitable economy that we all deserve. He's worked with groups like Transform Finance, and he's also worked in the world of philanthropy. And his work is primarily driven by a single fundamental question, pretty deep here. How do we transform how power and resources are shared in our economy while truly centering the brilliance and bravery of those who have been systematically excluded? And Eric is joining us from New York City, so welcome, Eric. And we're also going to start with David Lezaks, who is the Senior Fellow at the Croatan Institute, an independent nonprofit research institute working on harnessing the power of investment for social good and ecological resilience by doing work in that space where sustainability, finance, and economic development all intersect. As an environmental scientist and financial activist, David's work is centered around developing more innovative mechanisms for financing the transition to agroecological farming and food systems. He's got deep knowledge of ag finance. He's written a lot about how we can finance regenerative ag specifically. And he's worked with groups like the Delta Institute, RSF Social Finance, and Mad Agriculture in Colorado. And David is joining us today from snowy Madison, Wisconsin. So welcome to you both. Starting with the two of you here, because we really want to ground this conversation in some of the core challenges that arise when we start talking about finance generally, but certainly when we want to use money as a tool for systems change. We want to kind of untangle the ways that money and power are intimately connected in the work of advancing institutional investment in food, but also just the country more broadly. And we know it's really critical to understand this because there's a lot of work to be done, frankly. There's also, right now in this moment we're living in, a lot of buzz about things like regenerative agriculture and community engaged investing. And both of those offer sort of new templates for ag production and ag finance. So before we dig into sort of the praxis of this work and talk to Zach and Monica, our other speakers here, we thought it would be nice to start with laying out those important principles, especially for those of us who, and I'll own up to this, think of ourselves as a little wet behind the ears with finance. I don't see ourselves as finance people. What do we need to consider when we're thinking about finance and funding as a tool in the institutional food space? So Eric, we'll start with you here. Your work at Common Future and before with Transform Finance, in all of that, you focus a lot on power, choice, and ownership as core principles of a racially just and fair economy. And when we connected, we talked a little bit, you shared stories of how it just seems to always be the case that the finance world divides itself or falls into this dichotomy of haves and have-nots, where the wealthy individuals and institutions, including the well-intentioned ones, are very often totally separated from their less wealthy counterparts, who are ironically very often the focus of their investments. So with all the work that you've done, educating and power building with groups across the country, talk to us a little bit about how that dynamic shows up in the investment world, whether that's philanthropy, or impact investors, or even in your experience with more traditional finance, and help us understand like why that's problematic, what's dangerous about that division, and also share just some of the ways that you've helped community-based orgs see themselves and the individuals within them see themselves as entities who belong in this world that's so veiled. So yeah, Eric, let's take it away.
Thanks, Elliot. I'm just doing a tech check. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, because like my phone's broken and that's in the shop, and then just like my laptop is loud. It's awful. But you know, welcome to today now. So actually, Elliot, you brought up a lot of things. So I'm actually going to just break it down into two of them. One is kind of like how it shows up in terms of division between folks that are, you know, we can call it on the ground in the community, and on the ground in the community, and folks that do more of the capital allocation or investment. And when I just tend to say capital allocation because that can mean grants, that can mean the government, that can be investors, but it's usually people that are in offices rather than folks that are out on the streets. So I'm just gonna respond to that one first, and then the second part of your question, just, you know, pepper in or interject, you know, after I finish that one, the part about like how to support and what that has looked like, you know, in my professional work. Yeah, so thanks for having me, everyone. I see a couple friends on the call, and a lot of people that I haven't seen before. So it's nice to meet everyone. Again, my name is Eric. I'm the Director of Capital Strategies at Common Future, and I love all these questions. I wrote down some notes before the call, so that's kind of why I asked Elliott to keep me in check, because I would go on for like a half hour, as I did on our prep call. So I think a good start-off point for how I think of things, like despite me being usually the investor finance person in a lot of the spaces that I'm in, I don't consider myself to be one. It's all relative, right? So when I'm with a lot of my friends who are activists or community organizers or people that work more, you know, in the service industry, I tend to be the person that is less afraid of the spreadsheets. But I absolutely don't consider myself to be a finance or investment person. I consider finance and investment to be more of just a conduit or a resource to get things done. So, you know, I always see capital in all of its forms, be it social, financial, human. It's really just an asset or a resource. Intelligence is an asset, charisma is an asset. I really just look at all of these things as assets that can be translated into future benefit. And what I've seen in my work over the last 5 or so years is that there is something about money and numbers with folks that, you know, primarily focus on justice that really tend to trip people up. And the best that I try to do when I talk to folks is just saying, like, you've learned how to play the piano, speak Chinese, set up a farm in, you know, your backyard, set up a garden in your backyard. You've learned how to do these things. This is just another language, and this is just another resource that you can figure out. So I think a really apt kind of like metaphor is I'm sure folks have heard that, like, if you're not on, you know, at the table, you're on the menu, and given like the topic of the conversation, it feels a bit apt. I don't think that's sufficient enough. And the way that I kind of frame it to people is that if you're not writing the menu, then you can't control what's on it. So a lot of people are at, like, you just need to be at the table. But unfortunately, a lot of the people that I work with who are lower power, lower income, disenfranchised, don't have certain credentials, they get invited to the table, and then they're put in the corner and have no voice or no power or no say at all. So actually, it's sometimes worse because you feel very disenfranchised and no one's including you. But people tend to think that as long as you're at the table, that's enough. So the reason why I kind of bring up this, like, who's writing the menu piece, is until you're actually in a decision-making position around where capital is allocated or where it's invested, you're always going to be dependent on those other institutions. So easier said than done, especially for folks that aren't wealthy or folks that aren't like fund managers. But I always think about, like, who decides what governing body makes decisions around where capital goes, what the agenda is for, you know, what are we considering, and like, where's their leverage? I read this article from the Jacobin, which is like a very lefty, very, very lefty magazine, like, the other day, and they were just saying that, you know, Joe Biden didn't bring up a lot of progressive things, or he's going to leave a lot of progressive things on the table because a lot of the lefty progressives are they're putting pressure on him, but he can do whatever he wants because he's sitting at the front of the table. And they're talking about how do we sit at the front of the table. So for me, what I see over and over again, whether it's food, whether it's just access to capital for entrepreneurs, it's really about, and I see a lot of my friends, again, most of my friends are folks of color who are progressive, this aversion to like, if I take a seat of power, am I going to be corrupted? There's a real concern that we're going to become the problem. And I just have a lot of trust in them. They won't. But I always am thinking about, what if we don't do it? And then, if we continue the way that we're going. The last point that I want to just touch on, because I really just think about it, it's about power and who's making the decision, who's at the table, who actually has a voice at the table that is actualized. When you talk about the community folks or folks that are actually doing the work and folks that are allocating capital, they're usually separate. There are not that many unicorns out there that I know of that do both. And I've seen a lot of people with good intentions on both sides, out in the world, trying to understand capital flows, and then folks that have the money that want to do community engaged investment. They come together, and because they're separate entities, almost every time, even the well-intentioned investors wind up winning out. So their priorities, their needs, the conversation usually starts revolving around financial returns. And people always ask me, do you have to give up financial returns to do good? And no one ever asks me, do we have to give up social impact returns? No one ever flips it on its head. So because money has this weird, powerful draw to it, in our society, when those two sides come together, the ones with the money tend to win out. And that's why I really, this is the second part of the question. And, Elliott, if I want over, we can, push over it. But I really challenge my friends who, again, salt of the earth, grassroots folks that are in it for justice, say, like, we need you in those seats. Like, we need you to find a way onto the board, onto the investing committee. Like, I've challenged, my friends of color, my women of color friends, being like, have you ever thought of being part of the table to set the agenda? And they often haven't. And I think that that's a structural inherited entitlement issue. But it has to look different. Who's writing the menu has to look different.
Yeah, wow, that's a lot to untangle still even. Thank you for that, Eric. And Dave, I want to bring you into this. So in Eric's words, if this is a language, if finance is a language, then you're kind of like, you speak the dialect of ag and food systems real well, in my mind. You spent years dissecting and reimagining the tools that investors in this field use to calculate risk, return, and impact in order, exactly as Eric's describing, to know where to move or to decide where to move their capital. And you're particularly well versed, I think, in how this plays out in the regenerative ag space. You advise a lot of groups who are investing money now in innovative ways. And so since you have this sort of deep industry-specific expertise, let's say, I want to kind of tether this conversation and these dynamics in the food space, because money is, as Eric suggests, wickedly complicated and very, very, very nuanced, to say the very least. So I'm going to take the liberty of asking you an incredibly broad two-part question about how this applies to the institutional food space. First, help us, just for those, again, who may not feel super comfortable, help us understand in simple terms, like, why are we here? What are the market dynamics that influence how farmers, ranchers, and food businesses enter this big market channel, a large-scale institutional market channel? And then sort of more broadly, addressing some of those power dynamics and the imbalance in power of the folks with money and the folks without money. Does that show up in your world in the food space, whether it's a regenerative ag question or in other ways? Just help us understand how that power imbalance might show up for you.
Thank you, Elliott. And I would say similar to the way that Eric started off, is that I'm also don't consider myself a finance professional, even though that's the world I live in. I come to this table with a PhD in environmental science with a focus on food systems. But through the career as it's come to date, looking at the big levers in the system to be able to drive change and to be able to use what we see out there, oh gosh, that scary thing, money, power, dynamics. how can we, how can we leverage that for, I think, the outcomes and the outputs that this community is really rooted in. And as it relates to kind of these broader market dynamics, from the perspective of the Croatan Institute, we work on both sides of this spectrum, all the way, from the, spending time on the ground with producers, with processors, with the kind of the core elements of our food system across the country, and in some cases, in some projects across the world. And an hour later, after we finish those calls, we're gonna, put on the clip-on tie and head to a Zoom call with folks who are operating in the capital markets and who are talking big finance and the bond markets, and concepts that are rarely heard in the same conversation as where we might throw on words like mollisols or other soil types. And so we have this really interesting perspective that we're able to bring, that is able to trace through how capital flows today into the markets broadly, and into, whether we're talking about climate change, whether we're talking about racial equity or food, and begin to contrast that with how it works today, and how and the consequences of that, and why in many cases it's so broken, and how we think it might work better. What a redesign of that system might look like. And again, to borrow from Eric, thank you so much. Who's writing the menu here? If you look at, many of the sources of capital that go into supporting agricultural production and further up into the value chain, whether it's farm credit or FSA, commercial lenders, other sources of capital, those rules, those products, those mechanisms in which capital is used to flow to support these enterprises that are, at their core, helping to steward these landscapes that we count on, not just for food production, but for a variety of other ecosystem services, including of course, the community aspects of those. But it's the rules that are being written by those who hold the capital. And so how can we begin to reframe, again, that dynamic between money and power, around how we can think about those from the perspective of the biology, of the soil, of these dynamic natural systems in which we live in, that are increasingly stressed by not only years of extractive agricultural production, but by these extractive, also financial systems that are driving production for the benefit of those, in many cases, who hold the power and who hold the money and want to see that money back, and not from the perspective of what we call building soil wealth, or improving soil health and community wealth. So making sure that we were really being responsible and respect the work and the value that's being added from these frontline communities, especially from BIPOC communities, and those who might not have the same kind of access to capital, to other resources today. And we see now is the time to kind of open up that conversation. It should have probably happened 50 years ago, but better today than in another time step. But really, we're here to begin to, as from the institutional procurement perspective, begin to look at the many different values that come in in a product, in a basket of food, that it's not the currency is not just dollars that we're transacting on. It really goes back to soil. It's going back to all those environmental services. It's going back to communities. It's going back to building power, especially as it relates to land that, probably multiple generations back, in many cases, unless we're talking about our colleagues that Zach and others work with on our tribal lands, that land probably did not start with them, and it's been in some form probably taken or usurped in some way, and so it's really looking at this kind of retrospective way of how that money and power and capital was built, where we are today, how we move forward into kind of not only creating but really re-envisioning these relationships so that we're able to, engage in ways, especially with these large buyers, that began to have that conversation, not just about money, but around how we can talk about this kind of basket, basket of values, this true cost accounting approach that many of our colleagues in this sphere use, to really begin to talk about, why this is so important. And then once I think that, that level setting has been done, the financial question of how do we begin to pay for this becomes a lot easier, because what we're paying for actually becomes much more valuable. Did I hit the second one too, or you want to move on to other?
Yeah, no, that's
other
good. I want to ask a follow-up to just generally, business as usual. In the conversation we had last week about universities in this context, it was clear that a lot of the scale required for the production to get to the price point that doesn't do true cost accounting, that doesn't measure the full cost or value even of the product, is a big barrier. What's, in a nutshell, with regenerative agriculture at the investment level, how does that play out? What's the push to scale the practices that do account for all these other kinds of capital?
So I think that what we're seeing is new forms of organization happening, and some of these are ancient, to be honest, but ways in which especially cooperatives and collaboratives are being used across the agricultural value chain to to remove the friction between an individual operation and the value chain. And so, of course, from the perspective of an institutional purchaser, of which I'm not, it's understandably challenging to work with 1,000 individual producers, whereas again, as topics that are being covered, across the programming that you guys are putting on, how do we invest and how do we bring forward this this layer of infrastructure in which we can empower producers at multiple scales to begin to feed into, that then makes filling and bringing that demand signal to the table just much easier. And when we look at a more regional, resilient agricultural infrastructure, whether it's related to COVID, whether it's related to climate change, whether it's related to empowering BIPOC producers, all of that we're seeing in many cases a slate that has been wiped clean. In the Midwest here, we went from counties that had hundreds of independent grain mills to 0. And now it's time to kind of rebuild that infrastructure, but rebuilding that infrastructure takes money. It takes other forms of capital as well, human capital, political capital, but that is really one of the keys to unlocking kind of what we see now is the dynamic across the landscape, where many smaller scale producers can only financially support themselves through direct marketing, whereas the large ones can go into the commodity markets. And it's really time to reimagine how these market dynamics work, but it shouldn't be on the shoulders of just the production community to figure that out.
Yeah, here. Thanks, David and Eric. We'll open it, sort of have a broader conversation with hopefully the 4 of us. I think we're crossing our fingers that Monica can join us here for this second part, but I want to turn now to you, Zach, since you're here, and dig in a little bit more to the nuance about making this transition that David's pointing to. In such a commodity market-driven world, there's a lot of tension in changing these things that are the levers of the thing we call the food system. So within institutions like tribal governments and healthcare networks, let's talk about what happens, or at least what can happen, when those large purchasers and the folks who are pulling the demand of this equation have an analysis of the system, they understand their role in it, and then that they invest their money guided by the values beyond the bottom dollar, accounting for, from the roots up, the very nature of the products that they're purchasing. And I guess even more broadly, this always raises for me this question of, like, how the hell do we make incremental shifts in this massive, rigid system that has such an interest, honestly, in generating profits for large companies, and not soil wealth or soil health and community wealth. You know, if we acknowledge the food that we're talking about costs more, like we do now need to ask, well, how are we going to pay for it tomorrow? So Zach, I'm going to turn to you here and introduce you. Zach is the executive director of the Intertribal Ag Council, which is a Montana-based effort founded in 1987 to pursue and promote the conservation, development, and use of agricultural resources for the betterment of Native peoples. Zach's also a third-generation rancher on the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation, and much of his work in the past decade has been assisting farmers and ranchers with financial planning, refinancing, and restructuring their farm and food businesses. And his work sheds light on just how broken the ag finance system is, and he's devoted the balance of his professional life to building a new one, embodied in the new Native Community Development's finance institution called Akiptan, which we're going to hear a little bit about in a bit. And Zach's joining us today from the Cheyenne River Indian Reservation. So welcome, Zach. And hot off the press, I just got a private message that Monica is also here. So Monica, we're going to introduce you as well. Thank you for joining us. I know you were running around today. Monica Nikilski is the Director of Sustainability and Environmental Health at Blue Cross Blue Shield, Massachusetts, a large nonprofit healthcare provider network and insurance provider based in Boston. And with her team, Monica is responsible for providing vision and leadership in the design and development of Blue Cross Blue Shield Mass's sustainability and environmental health strategy. And in that, she works with the institution's senior business leaders, vendors, and manufacturers, as well as community partners to align and implement that strategy and create the business, environmental, and societal impacts through the initiatives of the institution. Before that, Monica managed the sustainability program at Partners Healthcare, another group in Boston. And there she oversaw sustainability program of efforts across 16 buildings. And I think she said 18 million square feet of space, which I can't even really wrap my head around. So Monica brings both scientific expertise and a business mindset to the field of sustainability. And we're really excited to have you with us today, Monica. Zach, I'm going to start with you here. We're now in the practitioner chapter of this conversation. When we talked last, Zach, you kind of like put some light bulbs off in my head, and you helped me remember that the words that we're using when we talk about this work with institutions investment are really important. I remember saying something kind of like, as David pointed to, like, oh, well, so many institutions don't want to buy this sustainable or local food or purchase from small Black or Indigenous farmers because it's always more expensive. And you said, well, what if it's not that it's more expensive, but that it's more valuable? And that question sort of stuck with me because it seems to be a thread that's central to your work, like helping prove that value and helping prove the value of the food economy that we're talking about building, and then translating that value into something that the finance world can understand. So you wear a lot of hats, often literally. We've seen the cowboy hats, and you shared that you sort of wandered into this world in a sort of circuitous way. So I'd love to ask you to share a little bit of your story and how you got to the Intertribal Ag Council, as well as talk about the project that we mentioned earlier, Akiptan, and really to just cue it up. How do you address power when you're thinking about making investments of money or time or resources or any of these other sources of capital? And what are some specific examples that you can point to where Akiptan differs from traditional finance or lenders in order to help Native-owned businesses grow and be able to serve these larger markets?
The best way we found to describe that, Elliott, and thanks for having us on here, is to take a regenerative ecosystem that's in need of regenerative practices. It's a desertified landscape. There's very sparse vegetation, and you got critters scattered all over that can't really realize the maximum benefit of herd impact. And in that ecosystem, the soil represents all of those producers that are out there that are just waiting to flourish, to have their resilience unleashed. And what's missing is water. And in this metaphor, water is represented by capital. At the edge of this desertified landscape, you've got an ocean, literally an ocean, but the water is salinated with the mission and values of the philanthropies or other institutions that have that money. And those are the institutions that I think that we need to start talking about agriculture with, not the tribal governments or the hospitals for purchasing, because, you know, the smallest McDonald's in the country would use all of the Indian owned hamburger in a day, because the product loses its identity and gets into this commodified system before we get a chance to realize any of the food dollar value here. So as we look to try to find a way to place that water meaningfully to let the soil grow, to grow more vegetation, so that then these herd animals can get together and have a meaningful impact and really grow a regenerative ag system, what's missing? Well, we need a cloud to take up that capital and displace it in one transaction to the producers. And that's what we've done with Occupiton. We serve as a clearinghouse for investment to get in one transaction to a producer, but we don't do lending and borrowing the way the rest of the world does. We do an investment and we wait for a year and we take a return on our investment and we leave the capital planted out there. We treat the capital as a perennial seed that's going to continue to provide us with a return, instead of what currently happens with your typical commercial capital, typical CDFIs even. They're in this extractive system where you put the capital out there in the soil and you extract it in the fall, and then you go back out and do the same damn thing the next spring, and you wonder why nothing ever grows and your ecosystem is deteriorating. That's exactly what's happening in the capital markets on a microeconomic producer-centric level. So we do a lot of work with those producers to help them put together a holistic plan, and we fund the plan and the person, not the assets within that plan. And we do it with a long time horizon. Our goal is to have enough capital accumulated that it's perpetually out there, like a deployed endowment, a 100% mission-based endowment, generating a return. By taking this different approach, we convert producers from a $23,000 a year debt service on $100,000 of capital to $10,000 a year. So the producer at year one, with a transfer of their finance to our model, frees up $13,000 of production income from existing practices. This doesn't even contemplate the boost they can get in a year or two or three after doing some regenerative practices. What we have to do, and what's going to be essential in enlisting the millions of farmers and ranchers and aspiring farmers and ranchers out there, we have to find a way to liberate that existing production income that's being generated from a commodity-based system into their control in a meaningful amount, so they can start to look at conversion towards regenerative ag practices. Because until we build a system where that production income, which happens every single year, is our primary vehicle for converting to regenerative agriculture, we're going to continue to be dependent on philanthropy, getting comfortable with the idea, treating it like it's charity, and wondering about when the carbon credits are finally going to get here. We have to start to look at the $458 billion a year income that's generated from existing agriculture practices and liberating that into our producers' working capital so that they can then have a real shot at converting to some regenerative practices.
Yeah, wow, that's complicated and also very, very clearly identified, Zach. Thank you for that. So Monica, we'll bring you in here. Zach's sort of got this perspective and experience at the farm level. You're unique in this conversation in that you're sort of on the purchasing end of the equation here, or the seesaw, so to speak. But also because you're currently representing a very large purchaser of food and other goods, not just food, with also a background on the supply side of this. So you're sort of, you've touched a lot of the whole ecosystem of institutional food. And so we're super excited to have you here. You've also just been doing the work of getting an institution investing in this for a while. You've been working closely with Blue Cross Blue Shield's food service management companies, your preferred vendors, the group purchasing organizations, all of those stakeholders along this pipeline. And so you really do intimately understand the role that contracts play in facilitating the pull, is this word I've used, but the demand for this sort of food, the regenerative values-driven food, let's call it. We know that without a robust marketplace of institutions buying the goods, in addition to investment vehicles, as Zach described, that value the long term here, the businesses that are making these products just really struggle. It seems particularly true with food. So now you are here as the director of sustainability for this really large healthcare provider and insurer. So to start, if you could just tell us a little about your role within Blue Cross Blue Shield Mass. And I'm really keen to hear you talk about how you've been able to translate your own personal, but also the institution's needs throughout all those links in the supply chain without compromising your values. I think we talked a little bit about that. And then just sort of in context, what's it like for Blue Cross Blue Shield to be doing this work? How important is it to the institution to be innovative and to be differentiated, as it were, amongst its peers and in its marketplace?
I hope I'm going to be able to cover everything. But before I get started, thank you for having me, and thanks to all of you for taking the time to join this conversation and for committing to this work. Because I know from my past experience, it really is more of a collective and collaborative effort, and I can't do it alone. And I think that this growing network is just going to solidify, not solidify, but really strengthen the foundation that we have and hopefully drive real, true, meaningful, and sustainable change. So as Elliott had mentioned, my formal title is the Director of Sustainability and Environmental Health at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts. And I laugh because, you know, when I join some of these conversations, you all are probably wondering, you know, why is a health insurer engaged in environmental work? Well, we know that it's not going to address the opioid epidemic. We know that it isn't going to address death with dignity. And some say it's interconnected and linked, but we're not going to completely solve mental health stigma and solutions. But we do, however, share this common philosophy that with healthy environments, we can support population and public health. My work is to collaborate with division, department, company leaders to integrate these principles into our strategy and operations so that we can continue to support collective environmental impact. But if we tend to focus on the food aspects of my work, you know, we think about how food is produced, processed. Maybe some of the other speakers already touched upon this: packaged, distributed, consumed. You know, in the US, it really has a significant impact on human health, on climate change, on air and water pollution, and the viability of future agriculture production. You know, from a health perspective, you know, I'm keeping tabs on the rising rates of food-related chronic illnesses that are socially and economically devastating to families and communities, but they represent an increasing drain on healthcare resources. And as a major player in healthcare, we know that we have a unique opportunity to develop these programs that aim to reverse negative food and health trends by continuing to model healthier behavior within our own cafeterias. So more sustainable food choices for associates and visitors, while also saving money by reducing food waste and stewarding natural resources through our partnerships with our food service management company, which Elliott had mentioned. We're able to increase the availability of local sustainable foods within our facilities, but by extension in the community. So I think about, you know, there's learned experience from my former company, the health system, and a health system, an institution where I manage sustainability. You know, he briefly introduced 16 facilities, 18 million square feet of space with 65,000 employees. That's a lot. But by doing so, I had an opportunity to work with 16 facilities that had their each own unique culture, logistics, and supply chain, and how we implemented the sourcing and serving of this local sustainable food. Some of those facilities were self-operated, which some of you here today might be, and some were supported by food service management companies. And of the food service management companies, I had a chance to work with the big three, Sodexo, Aramark, and Compass. We had Morrison Cafeterias. And what I learned as a purchaser and someone trying to influence buying decisions really was that budget, money, and incentives influence everything. One of our facilities, Spalding Boston, I'm going to share just some examples of what we did, and then maybe during Q&A we can do a little bit of more of a deep dive. But Spalding Boston, which was a long-term care facility, a rehabilitation hospital, really embraced food as medicine. They also happen to have a longer patient stay than Massachusetts General Hospital, our big 1,000-bed acute care facility. So we were looking at 27 days patient length of stay versus 2 to 3 days. So what does that mean to you, right? If they're in our facilities and in our care longer, we have to invest in their nutrition and health. And that really was taken to heart. And there was a business case that was developed. I mean, I'm skipping through a bunch of steps here, but the long and short of it was that we were able to demonstrate the need to support our patients with local sustainable food and increase the budget an additional $300,000 a year. And this was in 2013. And by 2018, they were sourcing and serving up to 76% of their animal proteins were antibiotic free. Close to 30% of their total spend was on local food. And their patient days went from 27 to 21. We don't know if that was the food directly or if it was attributed to many other aspects of moving into this new facility, which is really cool, but I'm not going to talk about because it's not food. But as a side note, I also have to say that this was a self-operated facility. And at the time in 2013, I had just joined the Environmental Council for Vizient, formerly Novation, a large group purchasing organization. These types of group purchasing organizations, this one in particular, 40% of products and services that go into hospitals across the country flowed through Vizient Novation. That's $83 billion worth of products. And by sitting on their environmental advisory board and as one of their largest customers, we were able to influence some of the decisions. And at the time, we were able to bring on new contracts for local foods, for antibiotic-free foods. And then of course, having the need to collaborate with the distributors at our local facilities. Unfortunately, we didn't use their contracts. We actually were able to negotiate better rates. I feel really bad because, here I'm putting pressure. I'm saying, you need this, we need to buy it, we're gonna buy it. And we ended up going outside of the contracts. But it was a first step for them to contract these products. And the good news is that we all use the same distributor, US Foods, and we were able to share our outcomes, which helped them in the next round of contract selection. Incentives. You all are probably familiar with the fact that food service management companies manage to P&L, right? They utilize their contracts and supply chains to maximize their products. There is also room for autonomous and spend, which I've found over the years is generally 20%. So if you're looking to push local sustainable food, and depending whether it's the seafood and meats, you have that opportunity to do so. But in a similar fashion, when you want to introduce products and offerings, it's key to bring them into their contracts and into their supply chain, and so that we all can benefit from that economy of scale. I found most often that when you work with food service management companies, it depends where you're on the sales cycle as to how much collaboration and support you're going to get. Like early on, you just signed the contract, everyone's starting strong. They're implementing all these different strategies you had discussed early on in your RFP and your contracts. In the middle, things get slow. People get comfortable. Things start to fall by the wayside. And then towards the end, there's this reminder of, hey, we can be a trusted partner. We're a great advisor. We can be, anything you need us to be, just let us know what you're looking for. And that's when you start to, and in my opinion, load them with the asks and make sure that that next round for contract negotiation, that you add this in there. It's really important. You know, one example that's not related to local food, but I just wanted to share another example that we had within our own facility was the incentives. So the general manager and the district manager, you know, they were incented to sell a large beverage company's sugar sweetened beverages. And that's because that's who they were contracted with. But it was our goal to reduce sugar sweetened beverages across our facility. We didn't realize that that's how they received their bonus. So they were doing everything they could in order to prevent us from implementing this work because we were taking money away from them. They might agree with us. They might be on our side 110%, but if you're telling them that what you want is going to impact their ability to bring home money to their family, you might get some pushback. So there's a need to understand those incentives and how people are motivated. I just want to also share that, you know, Brigham Women's Hospital, one of our facilities, you know, as we were transitioning to antibiotic-free meats, we realized, you know, for one chicken breast, 4-ounce, 5-ounce chicken breast, you know, we had to increase our spend to $85,000 a year just for this one item. So I lost my train of thought as to why I shared that. Sorry. But where we are today, Blue Cross Blue Shield, right? This crazy insurer, we're adopting environment, we're taking on health. So today I have the pleasure of working with one food service management company, Compass, across all of our cafeterias. We have 3 cafeterias, and Flick, which is a Compass subsidiary, is the one who supports us. We've been able to increase our local spend to 11% since I've been here in the past 3 years. We're currently calculating our sustainable food spend. You know, there is this need to balance the asks, as I'm sure you all are being faced with this. I mean, because when I've come in, we were talking about our food service ware, how we want compostable food service ware without chemicals of concern and those fluorinated chemicals. We're looking about increased food diversion activities, such as food donations. But then there's also the local and sustainable sourcing and serving. I would say that we too have embraced the food as medicine, like we did at my former company. And while we're committed to having an impact with our council members, there are things that we're learning from the Farmers Coalition in Wisconsin. Many of you might be familiar with this, and utilizing the research conducted in collaboration with the University of Kentucky and Anthem Blue Cross. We're exploring Csa reimbursements as a benefit to our members. So today we offer gym reimbursement. We have this benefit where after a year you can get money back, but we're pushing them to see, is there an opportunity to offer Csa reimbursement? Because especially with this past year, you know, not that many people, I mean, both are very important, but if you were to prioritize, I would say food is better to get on the table than the gym membership. Didn't really finesse that, but we are launching a second iteration of a culture of health toolkit. It's an assessment toolkit that we use with our accounts. Basically, we provide them with some standards, best in class goals of where we think they could be in terms of a holistic health and wellness program. And there are modules, they're delineated into numerous modules, one of them focusing on food, another with sustainability. But really, if we look at the food one, there is a recommendation, strong recommendation for local sustainable food. And then lastly, we have an app that we launched last January with a bunch of challenges. And the challenges span from stress management to smoking cessation to being physically fit to healthy, nutritious eating, but there's also acting sustainably. And that's where you're going to find a lot of challenges around environmentalism. What we do is we incent people and reward them, pay them money by participating and completing, because, you know, this is taking a very holistic health and wellness approach. And the next goal is, you know, we have a lot around energy and waste, water, but the next push is to integrate chemicals and food. And I'll stop there, knowing that we want some time for Q&A.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you, Monica. And that's it's such a, there's so much afoot there. It strikes me that some of the practices you just described look to me kind of like ways of making demand for the different kinds of capital that we were talking about before we turned to you, which is neat. Health, wealth and health are fused. So finding ways to incent both in the system are really important. I want to open up a conversation now for the four of us. And if you all had questions for each other, honestly, please, this is a great time to ask it. But I'll throw this thing out as well, because it's a clear theme across each of your perspectives. Seems like this is always the case, but relationships, individual relationships, are pivotally important in this work, whether that's between a purchaser and their group purchasing organization, a philanthropist and the community that the philanthropist tries to support, whatever. It always boils down to that in my mind. So I'll ask each of you, and this is a popcorn kind of thing, so chime in if you'd like, but how do you build and then maintain relationships, especially when you're encountering people, or maybe even colleagues sometimes, who don't necessarily see the vision that you have for regenerative agriculture, for a racially just economy, or for sustainable finance, whatever it is? How do you support those relationships over the long term in order to build this economy that we're talking about? What's the secret? Anybody can chime in.
I'm happy to start, because my role is really to manage through influence, right? Most of my work is done with the budgets of my peers and colleagues. And so the way I approach them is I do my best to interest, engage, and inform them about the topic at hand, why it matters to us, how is it linked to the business, but more importantly, try to understand their targets and goals and how it's going to help them achieve success with what they're doing. Remember earlier I mentioned incentives, and look for that shared win, for that positive environmental impact, but also maybe it's cost containment, maybe it's risk mitigation, maybe we're looking at growth opportunities, like the Csa reimbursement is a growth opportunity. We take pride in focusing on innovation as our value proposition. So if we're an innovative health plan and we're looking at how do we make people healthy, that's potentially a new way. So.
I'll go ahead and jump in, Elliott. I think one of the things that we do that really helps us manage, grow, nurture relationships is we always come with a solution. We will gripe and complain just as much as the next person about the problem, but we sit back, we have some time to contemplate, we tap into our network of friends who are similarly positioned, and we bring a solution to the table, one that we understand what it takes for whoever we're advocating for that solution to embrace it and adopt it. So take, for instance, the food distribution program on Indian reservations. We identified a problem that nationwide there's these food distribution hubs in Indian country. They act as hunger mitigation strategies. Many of our tribes see them as a treaty right, the least that the government could do in exchange for all of the resources that the United States has taken by hook or crook from our people. Currently, all food that goes to these scattered, diverse community serving institutions goes to two different warehouses, one in Kansas City, one in Las Vegas, Nevada, and then out to the reservations. A local regional solution was clearly needed so that we could have a chance of getting some local purchasing done there in those food distribution hubs. So we set to discussing that with our partners, enlisted the support of the Native Farm Bill Coalition, and we got a change legislated in the 2018 Farm Bill so that these food hubs now have a $3 million pilot project to demonstrate the efficacy of that local purchasing. And the idea is to eventually move the entire thing into that type of an approach where if there's a federal dollar being spent on food, that reservation community should have control of where it's spent, because we all have a lot of natural resources. We don't have a lot of food grown because the demand isn't there to generate the income that, or the investment that'll stand up the infrastructure. So, you know, have a solution is really a critical part.
I'll say something quickly. I really appreciate what Monica and Zach said, and kind of my response would relate to both of them. So Elliott, to your point of how do you kind of persuade or bring along folks that maybe not are on the same page as you? I think like my fundamental attitude is contrarian or antagonistic to the industry that I technically work in, if you want to call it the financial services industry. And David and I said at the beginning that we don't see ourselves as finance or investment folks, but we just happen to be. Because it's a big lever of influence and power and resources. But just, you know, I think, you know, I exist as an impact guy in a space that is not impact first. And I will say that even for impact investment as well. So I think that my existence is just that, living that kind of, you know, persuasion piece. And honestly, like, one thing that I try to tell a lot of folks, because people ask me about like fundraising or just like, how do I approach certain institutions or investors? And it's just something odd, like people, when you start talking about investment and money, like I said in my opening too, like everything gets very different. And when I heard, you know, Monica and Zach just talk now, it's about incentives and solutions. And I think somehow when you talk about, you know, investment, things get all, you know, thrown to the wayside. But I just really think of like human nature. How do you persuade people? How do you get people to act? And understanding, I always advise folks that are trying to raise money is I'm like, you know, if you want to have an effective negotiation, you just need to understand the incentives and where they're coming from and what they're going to move on. And if that has to do with investment in farming and small businesses, that's in politics, it doesn't matter. It's just really an art of persuasion that comes down to human nature. And I just would, you know, really encourage everyone to lean on the fact that you've built bridges and you've built coalitions and you've worked with folks that don't have your vision all the time. And you know, someone chatted me in the chat that said, like, you know, just learning the language of finance or investment, like some of the things that what the product that Zach was mentioning, again, the negotiations that Monica mentioned too, it's, you know, you know how to read the contract, you know how to roll around in the terms. And then from that point, you can just say, yeah, my solution is to use those terms and then push the envelope on it. And that's not like magical finance. That's like not magical financial engineering. It's just about understanding the terms and then understanding how humans act.
And I was going to speak a little bit to relationship-based lending and investing. I think to even echo some of the things that Eric had mentioned, especially across the farm lending landscape. You know, there are kind of big structures at play, but so much, especially in rural areas of the country, so much of the movement of capital is based on these relationships and and the culture, really, and the culture in which, you know, surrounds both the financial piece and the agricultural piece. And culture is something that changes, and we're seeing a lot of discussion around that changing culture, around education, around how do we as a community that is interested in more sustainable, organic, regenerative, agroecological types of agriculture begin to have that dialogue with the communities that have the capital, and to begin to talk about that risk, return, and impact, and to begin to build that relationship, build that trust, and then begin to you know, as a consequence of that, we hope get to shift some of those dialogues such that capital begins to flow in different directions.
Yeah, it seems like the content of the conversation is just as important as the people in it. And you know, to that end, I guess I'll ask. I want to save just maybe 4 or 5 more minutes before Andrew turn it back to you to close out here. But we got a world on fire. We're all a year into a pandemic where everything has been uprooted in so many ways. So it strikes me that we're at a moment, we've been at this moment for a good 400 years, I'd say, but we all have to reckon with what's the real cost of keeping business as usual here. Maybe as a way of informing the conversation you just alluded to, David. So I guess I'll ask that question for those of us who are interested in impacting change. I have people in my life who hate the word impact because it both means nothing and everything. So I say that all with an asterisk, but what happens to our planet and our people if we don't manage to shift these discussions and to shift the rosters of the teams that we're talking about?
I'll go ahead and go first. If we don't change the way we do ag finance, today a producer is going to kill themselves. It's as simple as that. And what the hell does the climate and everything matter to that producer if he can't see a financial outcome that allows for him or her or them together to feed their family? What are we really talking about anyway? So how do we change that? Well, we've got to make sure that we're looking to equitably distribute the value in the existing food system to the producer and the consumer. And one of the talks that we had, Elliott, was about not more expensive food, more valuable food. And you think about that in terms of nutrition. Every person that ever fed a cow knows that a cow will overeat and waste if they're not getting a nutritionally dense food product. That's exactly what's happening with our society right now. We don't get the nutrition we need from the food we consume, so we consume more and waste more. So let's really get back to a more nutritionally valuable food, and then that cost will equalize itself.
Too big of a question.
I'll go. An inside joke with me and my friends that work in, like, I guess, the impact investing space, we kind of laugh because we feel like there's a lot of conferences and the conference to investment ratio is very off. There's a lot of talking about it and not as much flowing of information. So I really like Zach's point about solutions, and what I do on my job, we're like, we got to do stuff. We got to try stuff because everyone says that we want to move the money and they're just like, where do we do it? The ratio is way off. It needs to be inverted. It needs to be more deals being done and less talking about it. But to Elliott's point, just around, like, I don't know exactly everyone's background on the call. If they're asset managers, owners, farmers, I don't know where everyone comes from. But if you're not on the asset management side, but you have relationships or friendships or networks or folks that, you're close to or you can build with, I just think a lot about, this whole industry, like, impact industry broadly. It exists because it believes that what is happening today is not sufficient. And if you do not do anything, what currently exists will just perpetuate. So you exist and you're working on this stuff because you think something needs to change. But if you're not doing any of it, then nothing will change. So I don't know why folks that are allocating money don't understand that inertia is essentially, to Zach's point, what's the point? It's the end of it. So I'm just so baffled by the high cost of inertia. Like the counterfactual of, like, people are worried about doing things incorrectly. People don't understand, like, the massive negative externality that comes from inaction, or just externality in general that comes from inaction. And everyone gets up in the morning that pays attention in this space because they think that something needs to be done. And there's a huge cost of it not being done. And people don't really factor that in enough.
So there's a study that came out about 2 years ago that kind of tracked the hidden cost of the global food system that added up to about $12 trillion compared to a market value of around $10 trillion, with the majority being about $6.5 trillion of those hidden costs actually falling on the health side. So to me, so much of the negative externalities of our food system today lie on the doorstep of organizations and institutions like the one Monica represents. And that's why I think it's so important to engage, have the engagement between these two sectors that have been so siloed for so long, health and agriculture, and I would say, and across the other institutional actors in this space, because I think the solutions that need to come forward is going to need to come forward across these different sectors of our society that have been too far apart for too long. And I think it's really encouraging, if anything, that Monica, you and your colleagues are here, represented by others as well, and that between finance, agriculture, and health and policy as kind of an overarching driver to so many of the conversations we're having here in this country. If we don't begin to address these things, I try not to lose sleep over it, because that's why we're all here today, is because we are all addressing it, and we are all trying to move the system forward, or to break down the current system and envision a new one. That's what we're doing. I think that's that is our collective life's work. And for me, it's not worth the time to think about the alternative, because it's too scary and not enough time in the day for that.
So I'm going to take a provocative approach. The first thing that came to mind is, if we don't do anything, like, we all die. I'm sorry, I'm a little, yeah, right. But I was going to touch upon some of the points that David pointed out about health outcomes and the link with health and agriculture. But since he covered that, I'm really going to also bring up the issue with equity and really think about opportunities and looking at racism, systemic racism. And, we're here today because we're looking to source and serve more local and sustainable food. And we're looking to support local, regional businesses, many of which could be owned by BIPOC members. But what I've also understood through my experience is, when we're working with supplier diversity and supply chains, and we're trying to source some of these products, these groups happen to also be held to different standards. So we work with another small local business, and they can collaborate and partner with a larger vendor or distributor or producer. And they're just a regular business, and we calculate their spend for local. But if we're really trying to dig into economic development and ensuring that it's an equitable and fair system, we need to do away with these unnecessary, rigid definitions of what these diverse suppliers mean. Because apparently, when you're working with some of these smaller vendors and diverse suppliers, if they do happen to fall under minority-owned businesses, they're also expected to not leverage the supply chains, not leverage relationships of big businesses. How's that possible? Why? Because then they're not considered minority-owned businesses? So I just want to put that out there as something to think about as well, and work really closely with your supplier diversity colleague, if you're so lucky to have one, or work with your Chamber of Commerce and small business organizations to better understand the definitions and how to remove some of these barriers.
Yeah, thank you for that, Monica. I think there's an opportunity at every step of this ladder that we're on. I just want to say, we've got a few seconds left. Thank you each, to the four of you, for such an interesting, and I think kind of unique, I'm not going to say weird, but rare conversation in this space, because we're coming at this from very different angles, which is sort of the spirit that's infused the program that Andrew laid out, the institutional investment approach that Wallace is thinking here. I'm going to put in the chat box the four of your email addresses. You've both been very generous and said if anybody has questions, feel free to reach out to them directly. And yeah, I'd encourage, say this mostly for myself, but also for anybody on the call, let's just keep keeping it 100. Let's be honest about what the work entails and seizing the opportunities that we see in front of us. Thank you again for this conversation. I want to turn it back to you, Andrew, for any closeouts. Yeah.
Yes, I thank you so much for Eric and David and Monica and Zach for sharing today, and for Elliott for guiding us through the conversation, and so many great metaphors that you all shared for thinking about the work, and for, I think especially for FSLN members, as a movement, thinking about what's my place at the table, and realizing that you do belong there, and that when you're there, your perspective matters and you have valuable things to share. Or thinking about not picking from the menu, but rewriting the menu of choices. And Zach's beautiful metaphor of the ecosystem, thinking about if you have what water you have to bring, or do you know what needs water, where you can direct it. So there's so much I hope that you can all chew on and think about in your work